My name is Anna. I am 32 years old and I have been married for 7 years. My husband Sergey is a trucker. He is a wonderful man, caring and loving, but his work often separates us for long weeks. When he returns, I always wait for him with impatience, cook his favorite dishes, and try to make the evening cozy. At first I coped with the loneliness by immersing myself in my work and hobbies, but as time went on, the emptiness of the house became unbearable. The evenings dragged on as if the hours were slowing down, and I began to miss communication, lively conversations, human warmth. One evening, when Sergey was on another flight, I decided to register on a dating site. I was not looking for romantic relationships or adventures. I just wanted communication, new acquaintances, interesting conversations. I was sure that I could find people with similar interests without overstepping the boundaries of loyalty to my husband. I had high expectations. I dreamed of meeting like-minded people who would share my hobbies and with whom I could discuss books, music, and other joys of life. The first few days on the site were rather disappointing. Most of the messages I received were either primitive attempts at flirting or downright obscene suggestions. Instead of delving into interesting topics, I encountered trite compliments and vulgar jokes that only annoyed me. I was beginning to doubt my decision and thought that maybe this wasn't the right way to find the communication I needed. At this point, I felt sad and almost decided to delete my profile when I received a message from a user with the nickname Bookworm. Michael was completely different from the other members of the site. His first post caught my attention immediately and was so original that I reread it several times before replying. He wrote, "Hello, I noticed in your profile that you mention a love of classic literature." I was taken aback. Instead of the usual greeting or trite questions about how I was spending my time, Michael immediately started a conversation about the topic I was interested in. This question was not just in-depth, but showed that he had really studied my profile and paid attention to my hobbies. I was pleasantly surprised by this approach. Finally, someone was interested not only in my appearance, but also in what I love and what I'm passionate about. This was a rarity among the messages I received on the site. We started corresponding, and with each new message I realized that Michael was not just a pleasant conversationalist, but a truly erudite and intellectual person. His knowledge seemed limitless, and every conversation we had was a real discovery for me. Michael turned out to be a literature professor at the university, which explained his deep knowledge of classical literature and his ability to understand complex works. But what appealed to me most about him was his ability to speak engagingly not only about literature, but about a variety of topics. We would discuss the works of Shakespeare, his influence on world culture, and then suddenly move on to modern scientific discoveries or philosophical reflections on the meaning of life. Each of our conversations enriched my inner world, making me think about familiar things from a new perspective. The days turned into weeks, and I began to catch myself thinking that I was looking forward to every new message from Michael. Our communication became a ray of light in my daily life, filling my lonely evenings with meaning and joy. It took me a long time to realize how much I missed this deep intellectual interaction. One day, after a particularly interesting conversation about new trends in literature, Michael suddenly suggested we meet in real life. I froze with surprise. On the one hand, I really wanted to see this amazing man in person, to hear his voice, to talk to him without the constraints of chat rooms and screens. But on the other hand, I felt an inner fear. It seemed to me that this meeting could change our relationship and possibly move it beyond friendship. I was afraid that a real meeting could upset the delicate balance I was trying to hold. After much deliberation and doubt, I decided to agree to a meeting, but I set clear boundaries. Friendship only, no romantic intentions. I honestly explained to Michael that it was important for me to remain faithful to my husband, and that our relationship could develop only within the framework of friendship. To my relief, Michael took my words with full understanding and respect. We agreed to meet in a cozy book cafe in the city center. The place seemed ideal for such a meeting. Surrounded by shelves of books, it was conducive to relaxed conversation and intellectualizing. When I arrived at the meeting, my heart was a little tingling with excitement. Michael was exactly as I had envisioned him, a tall, thin man in his 40s with kind eyes and a slight gray on his temples. He looked like a real professor of literature, refined and thoughtful, in a strict but elegant suit. His manners were intelligent and calm. When we started talking, all the tension I had felt before the meeting immediately disappeared. Our conversation flowed easily and casually, as if we were old friends who had known each other for many years. Michael was even more interesting in person than he was in correspondence. His eyes lit up every time he talked about books, and his gestures emphasized every thought, giving his words a special expressiveness. He was so immersed in the conversation that it seemed as if the world around him didn't exist. We discussed books, movies, modern culture, shared our thoughts about life. Time flew by, and when I finally looked at my watch, it turned out that 4 hours had already passed, although it seemed that we had just sat down at the table. We agreed to meet again in a week to discuss a new book we were both going to read. Our conversation flowed easily and casually, as if we were longtime friends rather than people who had only recently met through a monitor screen. Michael was even more interesting in person than I had expected based on our online conversations. There was a special light in his eyes every time he talked about his favorite books, and his face came alive when he moved into descriptions or discussions of plots, characters, and ideas. When he talked about literature, his voice sounded so inspired that I could literally see how passionate he was about his subject. His hands gestured constantly, emphasizing every thought, as if each book he spoke about had not only pages, but a soul that he was trying to convey through his words. We immersed ourselves in a discussion of the new novel, and then moved on to more distracted topics, from literature to philosophy to culture. Time flew by, and it seemed like only a few minutes had passed since we sat down at our table in the cozy book cafe. But when we finally looked at the clock, it turned out to be over 4 hours. I was a little shocked. How quickly time had flown by in his company. But it was a pleasant shock, because at that moment I realized how valuable and fascinating our communication had become. Before we said goodbye, Michael suggested we meet again the following week to discuss a book we were both going to read. I happily agreed, because our meetings had become more than just conversations about literature. They filled my days with the meaning and joy of fellowship that I had been looking for so long. Back home, I suddenly felt a slight sense of guilt. Even though nothing had happened between Michael and me that could be considered reprehensible, the very fact that I had kept these meetings from Sergey began to weigh on my conscience. I had always tried to be honest with my husband, and it was one of the fundamental principles of our relationship. But now, sitting at home in silence, I began to think, is it right that I meet with another man, even if it is purely friendly communication? Dishonesty, even as small as hiding these meetings, made me feel that I was violating something important in our relationship with Sergey. When Sergey returned from the voyage, I gathered my courage and decided to tell him about my new friend. I was afraid that he might take the information the wrong way or feel cheated. But to my great surprise and relief, Sergey took my words with complete understanding. He even smiled and said that he was glad that I had found an interesting interlocutor with whom I could talk about literature, and added with a slight joke, "Now I wouldn't have to listen to your lectures." His response calmed me down and relieved the tension I had been carrying inside. I was grateful for his trust and support. As time passed, our friendship with Michael continued to grow stronger. We met regularly at the same book cafe, each time looking forward to our discussions of new books and deep conversations. But one day, during one of our meetings with Michael, something unexpected happened. We were sitting at the same cafe table discussing a new novel by a contemporary author we had both recently read. Michael was talking passionately about the strengths and weaknesses of the work, and suddenly he stopped halfway through. I looked up and saw that he was looking at me seriously and thoughtfully. There was something in his gaze that made me feel a little uneasy. "Anna," he began with a note of tension in his voice, "I need to tell you something." My heart sank. At that moment, I felt a wave of anxiety rise. Was this really going to be what I'd been dreading for so long? Was he going to confess his romantic feelings for me? I'd been avoiding such thoughts all this time, so as not to ruin our friendship and complicate my life. But deep down I knew that this moment might come. But what Michael said wasn't what I'd expected. His voice shook slightly. I decided to get married. At first I was relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. All my fears were in vain. But then, unexpectedly, I felt a slight disappointment. Had I really hoped for something else? But I quickly pulled myself together and congratulated him sincerely, shaking my friend's hand with a smile. It turned out that Michael had been dating a colleague from the university for months. He hadn't told me about it, because he wasn't sure if the relationship was serious. But now he realized he was in love and proposed. "You know, Anna," Michael said, "you've taught me a lot. Our friendship made me realize that I'm ready for a serious relationship. Thank you for that." Exactly one quiet and familiar evening passed for Michael and me. A week later, I got a text from him. "Anna, I want to invite you to dinner. This time not at a cafe, but at my house. I'll cook something delicious. It'll be cozy. How would you like that?" The invitation was unexpected. Although our meetings had always taken place in neutral places like cafes, the idea of coming to his house seemed normal, given the level of trust we built up over the course of our conversations. I agreed, even though I felt slightly uneasy. The evening was set for Friday. I had carefully chosen an outfit to make me feel comfortable and confident, but at the same time, not to look too dressy. When I arrived at his house, Michael met me at the doorstep with a wide smile, and it immediately dispelled my doubts. He lived in a small but cozy house, and I noticed that there were paintings on the walls that reflected his taste and hobbies. The shelves were filled with books, which was in keeping with his image as a literature teacher. There was a roasted chicken on the table and a bottle of red wine next to it, which I couldn't help but admire. "Come in, make yourself at home," he said, pointing to the table set for us. There was a warmth and welcome in his voice that helped me relax. The chicken was indeed excellent, with a golden crust and an appetizing flavor. We began leisurely conversations about literature, discussing favorite books and authors. Time flew by, and I found myself enjoying every minute of this meeting. Before I knew it, we had finished the first bottle of wine. I tried to drink a little, but the wine was soft and pleasant, and the conversation, as usual, was easy and relaxed. When Michael pulled out the second bottle, I wanted to refuse. "Michael, I'm not sure I should have more. I've had enough wine already." I tried to dismiss the offer gently, but his confident look made me think twice. "That's all right," he said with a smile. "Let's drink to good cheer and good conversation. I was preparing this dinner to spend time with you." I couldn't resist his insistence. How could I refuse a man who was trying so hard to make me feel comfortable? I nodded and we toasted to our friendship, unaware that the evening would be a turning point in our relationship. "Anna, don't be so serious. This is a reason to celebrate. We should drink to a successful wedding. You want it to go well too, don't you?" He replied with a smile as he filled the glasses. I couldn't help but smile back at his sincere desire to celebrate. His optimism and the ease with which he handled the situation was reassuring and relaxing. After all, this was our first time meeting like this, and I really wanted it to be memorable. I agreed, and we had another glass, once again immersing ourselves in conversations that had become familiar and close to us. This time the topic was our favorite poetry, and the wine seemed to loosen us up. With each sip, I felt the tension go away, and our laughter became a little louder and our words more frank. We discussed the works we had loved in our youth, shared our thoughts on them, and with each passing minute I felt that something more than friendship was forming between us. When we finished the second bottle, Michael headed back to the kitchen. I asked, a little surprised, "Is there really more?" When he returned with the third bottle, he had a mischievous smile on his face. "Well, now that we've started, we should finish. Remember our college years?" He grinned, winking at me. I, of course, remembered those times when we were younger and less cautious. The third bottle, however, was unnecessary. I almost stopped keeping track of how much I'd drunk, and I quickly realized that my thoughts were starting to get jumbled and I was getting a little dizzy. My words were getting slurred, but that didn't stop us from continuing our conversation, which flowed from one topic to the next. We talked about everything. Books that had left a deep impression on us, our past, and the funny story of how we'd first met on the site. Michael joked that fate had brought us together to prepare him for married life, and I just laughed, delighted at how easily he kept the conversation going. The last thing I remember was both of us sitting on the couch, relaxed and laughing at something silly. The moment our eyes met, something special hung in the air. He suddenly pulled me to him. It was unexpected and inappropriate, because I was confused by the wine I drunk and my rapidly changing thoughts. I didn't protest, but I wasn't sure I wanted to continue either. An inner voice whispered to me to stop, but the alcohol had robbed me of my ability to think clearly, and it had happened on its own. His lips touched mine, and it wasn't what I expected. I felt his warmth, and in that second I realized that this decision could change everything. We just fell asleep next to each other without saying another word, falling into a sweet dream that covered us like a warm blanket, making us forget about reality. When I opened my eyes, the first rays of the morning sun were streaming through the window, casting the room in a soft golden light. For a moment, I didn't realize where I was, trying to remember how I'd gotten here. My head was throbbing from drinking the night before, and every moving ray of light seemed painfully bright. After a couple seconds, the memories came crashing down on me with full force, and I rose abruptly from the couch and turned around. Michael was lying next to me, unclothed, sleeping peacefully, as if nothing could disturb his rest. I looked down at myself and realized that I was unclothed, too. At that moment, it was like something clicked inside me, and I felt a cold wave of panic wash over me. My head continued to throb, but what bothered me the most was the guilt that came over me like a tide, leaving nothing but emptiness behind. What had I done? I got up quietly, trying not to wake him, and headed for the door. My steps were cautious, but at that moment Michael moved and opened his eyes, and his sleepy gaze caught mine for a moment. "Anna, are you leaving?" His voice was sleepy and a little hoarse, as if he had just come out of a deep sleep. "Yes, I have to go," I said, barely containing the tremor in my voice as I felt something in my chest tighten with confusion. "Wait," Michael said, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. "Thank you for last night, it was great." After he said that, as if someone had yanked me off my feet, I sprinted out into the street without waiting for him to explain. Everything inside of me turned upside down, and I could feel the adrenaline rushing through my veins, making my heart beat faster and faster. As soon as I got home, the only thought in my head was that Michael had deceived me. My anxiety only increased, and I decided to find out the truth about his fiancée. I began searching for information, immersing myself in an endless stream of news and social media posts. It soon became clear that there was no fiancé. It was all just an act played out to get me into bed. A sense of betrayal boiled up inside me, and I felt a cold wave of hatred wash over me. How could I have been so naive? When I got home, Sergey hadn't arrived from his flight yet. I just lay on my bed, staring at the ceiling, as if it could give me an answer to all the questions that plagued my soul. The same question kept running through my mind. What now? My thoughts fluttered like caged birds, and every moment seemed agonizingly long. It was as if everything that had happened before that night had suddenly lost its value, and I couldn't figure out how to live with that knowledge. I needed to sort myself out before I talked to Michael, much less Sergey. With each passing second, I was realizing more and more that I had a hard road ahead of me. A day passed, then two. I avoided Michael's messages, not knowing how to continue communicating after that horrible night. My feelings struggled inside me, the guilt I couldn't drown out in front of my husband, and a vague regret that what I'd feared all along had happened. I felt like a traitor, unable to forget that moment of weakness. Shame filled me like dark moisture, preventing me from breathing properly. As time went on, I was overcome with thoughts of how all this could have happened. Finally, after a few days, I couldn't ignore the phone calls from Michael any longer. I picked up the phone and his voice sounded cold and determined. He stated that either I would come to him again, or he would tell Sergey what had happened. His threat shocked me. As if stabbed in the heart, I realized that now I had no other choice. My mind was spinning. How could I be in such a situation? Then I hung up the phone, clutched it in my hand, and made a difficult decision. I decided to tell Sergey myself about what had happened before someone else did. When he came back from the road, I sat down next to him and, gathering all my thoughts, began to tell him. It was hard at first, the words stuck in my throat, but then I just told him everything with all sincerity and fear. Sergey listened, his face growing serious, but he didn't interrupt me, which gave me a chance to talk. When I finished, he looked thoughtfully out the window, then turned to me and asked for Michael's address. His calm voice was a little soothing, even though I realized it was just a mask. "I know it's hard, but we have to stop him," he said, then added that I should call his place and let him know I'd be there in half an hour. I stayed at home, not knowing what to do next, as if I had an unsolvable riddle hanging over my shoulders. Sergey had gone to visit Michael, and this moment of waiting seemed endless. I tried to imagine what was going on there, but my thoughts only became confused. Finally, Sergey came home. His expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes that I couldn't make out. "Don't worry, there's nothing else to worry about," he said, as if he had a plan ready. "Just don't let it happen again." I nodded, though there were still a lot of unanswered questions in my heart. After that meeting between Sergey and Mike, he hadn't called again. I tried to find the courage to talk to Sergey, because our relationship needed attention too. Eventually, the hard conversation took place, and although it was filled with pain and misunderstanding in the beginning, things got better with time. We began to build our union anew, as if restoring the fragile relationship after the storm. 6 months later, Sergey told me a secret that surprised me. He confessed that he did not hit Michael as hard as I thought, but only lightly patted his face. This simple cruelty was enough for him to realize that he had overstepped his bounds and that his actions were unacceptable. I was relieved to realize that it had been without unnecessary violence and that he had protected our family in this way. On the other hand, it became clear that Michael was a coward. His blackmail and manipulation tactics worked only against the weaker, and he was not prepared for the real consequences of his actions. After talking to Sergey, he disappeared from our lives, stopped writing to girls, and soon moved to another city altogether. I felt relieved and confident that he couldn't hurt us anymore. Sergey and I continued to move forward, and at one point in our lives a miracle happened. We had a daughter. This event was a real sign to me that Sergey had forgiven me completely. In his eyes I could see love and hope for a bright future, and I realized how much this new life meant to both of us. We started making plans and dreaming of a future filled with happiness, knowing that we could overcome any obstacles together. Story 2. I've been a trucker for many years now and have seen a lot in that time. Long hours behind the wheel make me think and reminisce. But the most interesting thing is the stories told by fellow travelers. Sometimes you pick someone up on the highway, and for a few hours of traveling together you get to know a whole life. I once had one case that was particularly memorable. It was last fall. I was returning from another trip when I saw a young guy on the side of the road, voting on the road. Usually I don't take hitchhikers, but that night something trembled inside. Maybe it was fatigue, or maybe I just wanted company. Anyway, I slowed down and opened the door. The guy quickly jumped into the cab. He looked to be about 25 to 27 years old, thin, with slightly disheveled dark hair and sad eyes. He introduced himself as Andre. The conversation didn't go well at first. He answered one-wordedly, looking out the window at the scenery passing by. I did not insist. Over the years of work, I got used to silent fellow travelers. But after a while, Andre himself started talking. Apparently, he had a lot on his mind, and I turned out to be a suitable listener, a stranger whom you would never see again. Sometimes it's easier to open up to such a person than to your close ones. Andre's story turned out to be banal and tragic at the same time. Just recently, just a month ago, he married a girl named Alina. They met 6 months ago, a classic story. They met in the company of mutual friends, liked each other, started dating. Andrew fell in love like a boy. Alina was bright, cheerful. With her was easy and interesting. Relationships developed rapidly, and after 5 months they filed a statement in the registry office. The wedding was modest, but cheerful. The newlyweds were glowing with happiness, making plans for the future. Andre worked as a manager in a construction company. Alina worked as an administrator in a beauty salon. There was not enough money, but they were young and full of optimism. They rented a small apartment and slowly settled down. It would seem that everything was going well. But the happiness did not last long, just a month. On that ill-fated day, Andre returned from work a little earlier than usual. The boss let him go early for a successfully concluded deal. He was walking down the street, anticipating a meeting with his favorite wife, when suddenly he noticed a familiar figure ahead. It was Alina. Andre immediately recognized her gait, her hair, her favorite flower dress. She was hurrying somewhere, glancing at her watch every now and then. Andre wanted to call out to her, but something stopped him. Maybe intuition, maybe just curiosity. He decided to follow where his wife was in such a hurry. Alina walked quickly down the street, turning into alleys. Andre tried to keep his distance so that she would not notice him. Finally, she stopped near a parked car, a black BMW. Andre had never seen this car before. A man got out of the car, tall, well-dressed, about 40 years old. Alina threw herself into his arms. And then Andre saw them kissing, passionately, like people who had known and wanted each other for a long time. Everything broke off inside him. Not believing his eyes, he watched his wife get into the car with a stranger, and they drove away. Andre did not remember how he got home. His head was spinning with scraps of thoughts and memories. How could she? Why? Had everything been a lie from the beginning? Or had it started recently? Maybe he was doing something wrong? Questions, 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 and no answers. At home, he mechanically packed his things into a gym bag. The essentials, clothes, documents, laptop. Then he sat down and waited. Alina returned a couple hours later. She looked a little disheveled, but happy. When she saw the bag and her husband's gloomy face, she understood everything. Andre, I can explain everything, she began. But he didn't let her finish. Silently he stood up, took the bag and went out the door. The last thing he heard was her sobbing and screaming. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. I love you. But he didn't turn around. And so now he was driving wherever he was going, not knowing what to do next or how to live with this pain of betrayal. As I listened to his story, my heart was compassionate. I had heard so many such stories in my life, of love, betrayal, broken dreams, and every time I thought, how fragile human happiness is, how easy it is to destroy everything. We drove in silence for a while. Then I dared to break the silence. Did you think maybe we should talk to her? Hear her side of the story? Andre grinned bitterly. What is there to listen to? Everything is already clear. I was just a convenient option for her. Marriage, stability, and in her heart she is with her rich lover. I shook my head. You know, kid, I've seen a lot of things in my life. And I can tell you one thing, nothing is ever easy. People make mistakes, do stupid things. But that doesn't mean they don't love. Sometimes fear, Insecurity, a moment of weakness can lead to terrible consequences. But it does not cross out all the good that was. Andre thought for a moment. It was obvious that my words touched something in his soul. Maybe you're right, he said at last. But how to live with it now? How to trust her after such a thing? I sighed. That's the hard part. Trust is a fragile thing. It's easy to break and very hard to rebuild. But if the love is real, it is possible. The main thing is honesty and the desire of both. You know, I think that you are now on emotions. You need time to think everything over. Live apart for a while, get your thoughts in order. And then when the pain subsides a little bit, talk to her. Listen to her, try to understand her. And then decide whether you can forgive and start again, or better to separate. Andre nodded. I guess you're right. Now I really cannot think straight. Thank you for listening, for the advice. I smiled. You're welcome, kid. You know what the beauty of my job is? I get to meet a lot of different people, hear their stories, and I realize that we're all basically the same. We all have our problems, our joys, our mistakes. The main thing is not to give up and believe in the best. We talked for a while longer. I told Andre a few stories from my life and work. Gradually he thawed out a bit, even smiled a couple of times at my jokes. When it was time to say goodbye, he didn't look so lost. Thank you again, said Andre, shaking my hand goodbye. You have no idea how much you've helped me. I patted him on the shoulder. Take care of yourself, boy. And remember, there are no hopeless situations. The main thing is not to make hasty decisions. Andre nodded and left the cabin. I watched him walking down the street, squaring his shoulders, not broken, but just a thoughtful man. And I thought, who knows, maybe this meeting changed someone's fate? Maybe it gave love a chance for salvation? I started the engine and set off. There was a road ahead, new towns and new stories. And somewhere out there, in the big city, the fate of another family was being decided. I sincerely hoped that everything would turn out well for Andre and Alina. After all, life is a complicated thing, and sometimes you just have to give each other a second chance. A lot of time has passed since then. I often remember this story and think, how did the fate of that guy turn out? Were he and his wife able to overcome the crisis, to keep the family together? Or did they split up and start a new life separately? I will never know the answer to this question, but I want to believe in the best. And I continue to drive on the roads, listening to the stories of fellow travelers. And every time I meet new people, I think, what story will they tell? What will they teach me? Every fate has its own wisdom, its own lesson. The main thing is to be able to listen and hear. And then the road of life becomes not just a journey from point A to point B, but a real adventure, full of discoveries and revelations. I want to apologize for any mistakes in the text or dubbing. I'm just learning, and the language of this channel is not my mother tongue. The dubbing is done with the help of artificial intelligence. Please point out errors so I can fix them and improve the quality of the content. Also, I will be glad if you share your thoughts on the topic. Your support in the comments is very motivating for me to keep looking for new, interesting stories. Thank you for your understanding and participation. Subscribe to the channel and put a bell to not miss new stories.